Another way, general methodology for gaining insight into a neural correlate is by looking at brain damage. As I said before, we identified many of the functional areas by looking at what lesions will damage. You know, if you scrape out a bit of the brain, what doesn't work? And so one example of this is of interesting research, really interesting research, in terms of lesion study, is a phenomenon known as blindsight. In blindsight, there's a lesion in the occipital cortex. Again, that's visual processing that creates an area in the visual field. The visual field is what I can see with vision, and so there's, you know, if there's damage to a particular area in my occipital lobe, then there'll be a certain area in my visual field that is blind, where I can't get any information about what's going on in that area. And scientists are able to map the location of the visual field that's blind. You know, it's called a scotoma. That's the blind area. And so you see the image here has this sort of keyhole shaped black spot, which is where, for this particular patient, their scotoma is. That's their blind spot. What's interesting with blindsight is that you can present a stimulus in the blind area, and the person will nonetheless be able to guess the nature of that stimulus with better than chance accuracy, oftentimes 80 to 90% correct. So you put a particular stimulus, you'll say, are these lines horizontal or are these lines vertical? And they'll be like, I don't know, I can't see them. And you say, well, you know, just guess. And they'll say, well, okay, horizontal. And they'll get it right. Vertical, right, vertical, right. You know, or they could put colors. Is this red or green? They'll guess and they'll be right more often than chance. Letters, words, more often than chance. So blindsight looks to be this phenomenon that gives us sensory processing, that they can process the stimuli unconsciously. So they're not conscious, they can't report seeing the stimuli, but they're able to report that stimulus is there by guessing. The other images that I have there are images that I found on the web that attempt to depict what it's like from the perspective of the blindsight person, or from the perspective of the person with the scotoma. You know, like to see that blind area. What is that blind area? So, you know, on the left is the image of the, you know, of you looking at that space, and on the right is the depiction of what it would look like to a person with a lesion in the visual field, that there would be this blind spot there. I'm not sure that that's the case. I'm really curious about this sort of depiction because I wonder if it's just empty. I mean, the depiction shows you a kind of blurry brown region, and that would be like if you had, if you were looking forward and there was, you know, like this extra blurry brown region in the middle. Alternatively, the blind spot could just be something missing. There's missing information from that area of the blind field, and what that would look like would be just a collapse of the information on one side of the blind field with the information on the other side of the blind field. An example of that is our blind spot that we have. You know, there is the retina is the area that receives sensory information, visual sensory information to the eye, and that information then is transferred down to a little I want to say tube wire. It's called the optic tract. Neural pathway, and where all of those neurons meet together in the optic tract, there's no sensory information. So the retina is organized topographically, that is, your visual field of the retina matches the topographic array of the world. So if something is out there, it appears out there. If it's on the top, then it appears on the top in your retinal image. Actually, it's inverted, but that's another whole problem. The idea is that the spatial relations of the world are reproduced in the spatial relations on the retina, except for that little bit of the optic tract that comes back. There's no information coming because that's where that's the pathway back to the occipital cortex. Yet we don't notice that. You don't notice that, and there are experiments where you can try to experiment with finding that where your blind spot is, and experimenting with having your finger disappear into your blind spot, I leave it to you to Google those opportunities to try to experiment with that on your own. But with our blind spot, we don't notice that there's anything missing. It just looks like the visual array to us, and we could explain that in the fact that we have two eyes and one compensates for the other. But even when you cover one eye, it still doesn't look to you like you have this blurry blind spot. So I'm skeptical of this depiction. I think it's an interesting depiction, but I'm curious about it in terms of whether that's really what it's like to people who have these kinds of scotomas. And I hope these kinds of questions are questions that occur to you in the future when you come across depictions like this, where an artist, a photographer, or a neuroscientist is making claims about the contents of consciousness. This is what it's like for this subject. Well, how do we know this is what it's like for this subject? Did you ask them if this is what it's like? Is this how they described it? Or is this just what you assume it would look like to have a blind spot in your visual field? The neuroscience question then is, how do we explain blind sight? How do we explain what's going on when the person gets visual information but isn't conscious of that visual information? Can this tell us what the NCC is of visual consciousness? And the general explanation so far that neuroscientists have for this phenomena involves two visual pathways. The first one, the dorsal pathway, is known as the Ware pathway, and this is preserved in blind sight. This goes up through the occipital cortex to the parietal cortex, and it allows that person to gain some visual information even though there's no visual consciousness. And what the person loses, arguably, in this explanation is the ventral pathway processing. And this is the what pathway that goes occipital temporal. Remember that with binocular rivalry, we also had interesting activation in the inferior temporal cortex. And here again, we have an interesting importance of temporal processing in terms of consciousness processing. So, so it looks like something is going on here with respect to consciousness, but we need more information to try to figure out exactly what this neural information about blind sight processing involves. So, we can ask then, on the basis of this result, what does blind sight tell us about consciousness? And as I suggested for the scientist, it proves that the neural correlate of consciousness is the inferior temporal cortex. And so on the basis of these two phenomena that we've seen so far, both binocular rivalry and blind sight, we're really looking at inferior temporal cortex as the locus of some interesting work being done by consciousness. And so maybe the NCC is the inferior temporal cortex. And here's the sort of brief argument for that. There's vision without visual consciousness in blind sight. Therefore, the inferior temporal cortex produces the visual cortex because it's the inferior temporal cortex that is the difference in terms of brain activity between when there is conscious processing and when there is visual processing, visual information without consciousness. Now, the objection to this view is that it's unclear why inferior temporal cortex is necessary to the consciousness. We still have the hard problem. Why couldn't, we just all be blindsight patients? Why couldn't we all get this visual information without having this extra bit of consciousness? What is consciousness adding to the story here? So this objection still applies to the scientist response to the blindsight studies. Alternatively, the Mysterian, the dualist, could argue that blindsight proves epiphenomenalism, could prove that we have consciousness without consciousness doing anything, that it serves no functional role, because in blindsight it looks like the functional abilities remain without visual consciousness. The blindsight person can still identify these stimuli even though there is no conscious processing. So the person seems to be a visual zombie, that is, the body is doing all the work without the conscious visual processing, so visual consciousness plays no role. It's epiphenomenal. On this argument. Now, an objection to the epiphenomenalist argument is that there are lots of functional things that the blindsight patient cannot do. A blindsight patient cannot guess without being prompted, so a blindsight patient isn't going to go around and guess the kind of thing that's the stimuli that's in the blind field. The patient needs to be prompted in the context of the study to have these guesses. Also, the blindsight patient will not utilize information in the blind field. So, you might be thirsty and want a drink of water. A drink of water could be placed in your blind field, and the blindsight person would not reach out to get that water. And also, the report of visual experience is obviously lost. The person says, I can't see anything in the blind field. And so, so this is a function. And remember, the epiphenomenalist claims that consciousness does nothing. It doesn't even cause our reports about consciousness. Because that's arguably physical. It's something that is, our brain is producing these words that I'm speaking, and my mouth is something physical. So something physical is causing these physical responses. And if consciousness is epiphenomenal, then consciousness has no physical causes. It doesn't cause anything. So it couldn't be the explanation of even my reports about my visual experience, or the blindsight reports that there is visual experience, or the blindsight reports that they have no visual experiences. The lack of visual experience also cannot be an explanation of their reports. So either way, these are things that can't happen. These are things that the blindsighter can't do, that it still seems like there's a role for consciousness. And again, we'll come back to the question of the function of consciousness later in the semester, but think about these phenomena now in terms of the neural correlate for consciousness, in terms of thinking about how the brain explains or fails to explain our conscious experience. Is there a neural correlate of consciousness? Do these experiments indicate that there's a neural correlate of consciousness? And how are we to look at what neuroscience tells us about consciousness? What is the role of the brain in our conscious experience?